Well, hi, folks. Thanks for coming back again. Mr. Bleeker here with the introduction to the respiratory system. Now, the respiratory system, we're going to divide into a couple of episodes. We'll look at the overall anatomy and purpose of the respiratory system. Then we'll look at exchange mechanisms, how we exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen to keep ourselves alive. And then we'll move into some really critical aspects where we look at the chemistry of that exchange and how carbon dioxide and oxygen actually travel in the blood. It's not always on a blood cell. There's a little bit more going on. There's some neat enzymes, so we're going to divide it into a series of episodes. So, the first thing I wanted to mention was really the three types of respiration. Now, in this image, I want you to sort of observe the first one is external respiration, which is exchanging oxygen from the atmosphere, which we need to produce energy to stay alive and to get rid of our carbon dioxide waste. So that exchange where we're breathing, through our lungs, that's external respiration. And that happens, one of the things we'll look at is the little grape-like clusters at the tippy tips of our lungs called the alveoli, where the exchange happens between the respiratory and the circulatory system. Now, internal respiration is what goes on once really at the level of the rest of the body, where we get the oxygen to the tissues through that superhighway of the circulatory system, and we get the carbon dioxide from our trillions of cells and get rid of that. And we have to have some manner of exhaust, and that's internal respiration, or moving those gases around. And the third thing is what we call cellular respiration. It's the third level. It's actually the whole point. Cellular respiration is when we use the oxygen that we've acquired from the atmosphere to burn our primary fuel, glucose. Now, whenever you burn a hydrocarbon, what do you get? You get carbon dioxide waste, just like what comes out of the tailpipe of a car. You get a little bit of water. You see that coming out of the tailpipe of the car. And what we really need to run our automobile, our processes of life, to produce energy. So that's cellular respiration. So make sure you're aware. 3 levels of expiration. First is external, second is internal, and the third is cellular. Okay, so I'm just going to go into my note set here. We'll move a little bit between sort of the note set and the course set. Let's go with this. And a little bit of redundancy here, but that's fine. We need oxygen to burn our glucose-based fuel so that we can fire all the processes of life. And it's really all about diffusion, transferring oxygen from the high concentration in the atmosphere into the low concentration in our blood, because we consume it with all of our processes very actively. Let's turn on my pen here. There we go. Excellent. Oxygen, it makes up a major component of the atmosphere. There's a lot of nitrogen, hydrogen, carbon in the atmosphere, but quite a bit of oxygen. It's what we need in our body. We are hopelessly dependent on it. We can't do our chemical reactions, can't process food, create energy. We need oxygen. The respiratory system, this is just a flat picture of it. I'm going to show you a neater one. But when you look at the respiratory system, it's a little bit more complex than you think, because you probably didn't think of your rib cage as being part of your respiratory system, but it most certainly is. So let's just leave the slideshow just for a moment and check this out. Now, this is called Breathe, Emma, Breathe. So you have about 30 seconds average ability to hold your breath, although my brother and I used to have a lot more fun than that, seeing how long we could hold our breath at the pool. Let's not keep her waiting too long. Now, as far as respiratory structures, these are all important parts here of the respiratory system. Your nose filters the air, warms and moistens it before it heads down the back of your throat, your pharyngeal region, down to your lungs. A bit more you probably hadn't thought of, right? Your voice box here with your vocal cords. We'll talk about that. This is your windpipe, aka trachea, and the bronchial tree, which are literally like roots of the tree, where you pass from major bronchi into subbronchi. Now, sometimes they'll call that primary bronchi, into secondary bronchi, into tertiary bronchi, and so forth. First, second, third, fourth in the order. No big deal. But what really becomes quite interesting is when you get down to the tips of the bronchi and you get down to these things called alveoli, these little grape-like clusters here. They're really thin, and that's actually where the exchange goes on between your lungs and your circulatory system. But how did the atmosphere get down in these lungs anyways? Well, I'll tell you right here. The diaphragm. Your diaphragm is pretty darn important because it's a muscle that divides your thoracic and abdominal cavities. When it contracts, it moves down, and as it moves down, it creates basically lesser pressure in your thoracic cavity. And if the pressure in your thoracic cavity, like your lungs, is such, the atmosphere will push its way in to that space. You've been doing something like this your whole life without realizing it. It's a good thing we don't have to think about breathing, really. But what happens, it's just like drinking a milkshake. You create lower pressure in the back of your throat using your pharyngeal muscles, and you think you're sucking the milkshake in, but what you're really doing is creating negative pressure, and the atmosphere, the world, pushes it into you. When this moves down and creates negative pressure, the atmosphere will literally be at a higher pressure than inside you, and the atmosphere pushes its way in. Let's take a little look at those alveolar sacs. So what happens at the alveoli right here is when you breathe in an oxygen-rich atmosphere and bring it really close to capillaries containing oxygen-poor red blood cells, oxygen is going to diffuse over. Doesn't require any energy. Pretty smart design, hey? So, what you'll also find is carbon dioxide rich content in the capillaries, in your blood cells and in the fluid surrounding the blood cells. And it's rich in carbon dioxide. There's the same richness isn't in your alveoli. In other words, higher here in CO2 concentration, lower here. Carbon dioxide will flow by diffusion from its high concentration into the alveoli, which is low concentration. So when you breathe out a whole bunch of carbon dioxide, which plants just love because they get to use it to make more glucose. So, same menu item. Couple things I wanted to point out. We know about our pharynx, but let's kind of go back up and look at our voice box. That's a neat little structure there. Now, it's not larynx, okay? It's larynx. It's a common mispronunciation. Now, what in your voice box right here, it's cartilaginous and gristly. It holds it open. And what you've got right here are your vocal cords. Now, that's in males, it's more pronounced after puberty, so you kind of get this thickening here called the Adam's apple. Now, your vocal cords, let's see if I can, there we go. Our vocal cords, basically, they're pulled on by muscles. They become thicker or thinner, and they sort of whistle in the wind, and it produces different tones, high tones and low tones, and allows us to speak, to sing. It's pretty amazing. Cool stuff. There's another structure right here that prevents you from choking. You should know about it. Now, this region right down here is called the glottis. Now, what can happen, if you notice, the esophagus is dorsal, and your windpipe or your trachea is more dorsal. So this access point has to be kind of guarded. So we have this neat little sort of flap called the epiglottis. It means above the glottis. And what it does is when you're breathing, it's not engaged. But if you swallow something, follow the food arrow, you'll see that it moves down, and that covers this region so that food can't pass down into your lungs. Now, if you choke, you're talking at dinner, and you get something lodged here, right? You'll try to cough and get it passed and back out, right? May need the Heimlich maneuver depending on whatever first aid's appropriate at the time. But if the glottis is working properly, it should cover over access to your lungs right here, and ensure that that doesn't, you don't get food, corn, mashed potatoes down into your lungs. So really neat little sort of picture here. Here's a nice image of how we breathe, and it jumps back and forth too fast, but as the diaphragm moves down, you inspire, and as the diaphragm moves up, you expire. But there's a little bit more to it. When you inspire, your ribs move up and out of the way to make room, and when you expire, they relax and come back down in. So that kind of pushes the atmospheric gas that's in your lungs back out. So there you go. True story. Okay. Thanks, Emma. See you again. Okay. So we're just going to go back. There we go. Go back to our slideshows. Make sure we don't miss anything here. And there we go. Awesome. Minimize that. So now that we've kind of done a tour of the respiratory system proper, you've had a chance to take a look at these, basically at these structures. There's one here. Let's turn this back on. There we go. There's one structure right here you might wonder what that is. And it says pleura. And our organs are contained in membranes. So the pleural membranes are basically like a bag for our lungs. And it's protective. We have a similar structure around our heart. It's called a pericardial sac. But the pleural membrane is kind of important, right? You want to bag these organs. That's good because it keeps them separate from other parts of the body. It makes it harder for germs to infect them. Another point is that we have cilia in our lungs. Now, this is another reason not to smoke. These fine little hair-like structures, they beat upwards all the time, and they move mucus and trap particles like dust and germs up to the glottis area so that we cough them up and expel them from the body or swallow them, because our lungs, it's very delicate tissue, and it's an easy source of infection. If I was a bacterium and I wanted to get into your bloodstream, boy, the lungs would be certainly a place I'd try to invade. So the cilia are doing a job constantly of sweeping mucus and other sort of particles upwards to keep us healthy. It's homeostasis. When you look at a sort of a side shot here of the head region, you'll see that it gives you a good profile of the nasal cavity and the pharynx at the back and the epiglottis, which sometimes I think is really underrepresented. I'm glad I showed you in the previous animation what it looked like, right? There's your epiglottis there. Your voice box, right? And that interface between your trachea and your windpipe. That's so important to know about. Every now and then, if you're laughing or anything like that, I find this particularly annoying when you're eating carrots. It is conceivable that you can get little particles here, and I find that's quite painful. If you've ever laughed, you've probably gotten milk out your nose, or Coca-Cola, nothing like, an acidic drink coming out your nose. Fizzing, I've seen fizzing over many a good story. The nasal passages are warmed intentionally. You just don't want to have really, really cold air, and where I come from, it's nasty. Filter it and warm it before you send it down the back. Okay, so just a quick mention. Don't really need to take any longer than that. And we can't really talk about the respiratory system without saying why it is we breathe in the first place. So this region, let's see here. This region right here, I'll just highlight our brainstem, or our medulla oblongata. It has the regulatory authority to sense our carbon dioxide levels and to a certain extent our oxygen levels, and it regulates our breathing. It's an automated process. You don't have to think about it, which is a good thing. And if you've ever hyperventilated, for example, and your CO2 levels are too low, your brainstem won't sense the carbon dioxide levels, and it won't think you need to breathe. So if you hyperventilate, that happened to a friend of mine one time when a cougar ran past them and they panicked. You take a bag and you breathe in your own carbon dioxide, and raise your CO2 levels so that your medulla oblongata senses sort of naturally occurring carbon dioxide and continues to tell you to breathe. Big cats, one of the natural inclinations of predators like that is they'll bite into the brainstem region profiled here. And if you bite into this and you effectively disrupt the function of the medulla oblongata, that's it. These are your breathing, aka respiratory centers. If you're not breathing, that's it. You've died. So they can haul you off and you enter the circle of life. Same thing for your circulatory center. It's here too. The medulla oblongata is shut down. That's it. Life processes end. This is a nice shot of it when you look at the medulla oblongata, and you can see how the nervous system here, represented by these, represented here. Here's the medulla oblongata, and you can see the instructions to the lungs there. You can also see that the medulla oblongata is listening to little bodies here. There's an aortic body there, and there's little receptive cells in your carotids right there, and they're sensing oxygen levels as well. So you've got some backup. Now, when you think about your medulla oblongata, it's picking up your CO2 levels, but these receptor cells in the more or less the aorta and the carotid regions is sensing your arterial oxygen levels. So that provides feedback to medulla on regulating your respiratory levels, right? Do you need to breathe? Have you held your breath too long? It's why underwater eventually anybody would just breathe in, because the CO2 levels rise too high and the O2 levels shut down, and that leads to a person breathing in water, and that will cause drowning, unfortunately. So just a couple of regulatory things here. You really do need to know this function of the medulla oblongata, right? All about establishing a breathing pattern, okay? And carbon dioxide levels in the blood are really what the medulla oblongata is listening to. So whoop, go like that. The oxygen sensors in the aortic region and the carotids, right, are paying attention really more so to the oxygen levels. But carbon dioxide levels are pretty well regulated in the body. They're being listened to. So you can hold your breath, but eventually there will be an override signal from your medulla. So hold it as long as you can. Let's see, I once got up to about a minute and 45 seconds. That was around my personal best. And this is, we've kind of talked about this already, but inhalation, just focus in on this where the diaphragm moves down, and that causes that negative pressure to bring the gas down the trachea. Literally, the environment pushes in, the lungs expand, and that's reversed when this moves up and the ribs relax. We've already kind of looked at that. Very neat. But the real story is when you get down from the bronchioles. Now, in biology, it's always interesting. You have the bronchi, and as the bronchi get smaller and smaller, the name gets longer. We call them bronchioles. And the bronchioles eventually lead to the alveoli. And when you look at a sac like what you see here, this is your alveolar cluster, also known as a sac. And that's where the exchange or the interface between the circulatory and respiratory systems occurs. So that you have a lot of these. This is a tremendous amount of surface area. So if you look at the lungs in this profile, you can see them. You see the bronchial trees. And when you look at the alveoli, you can see how the blood vessels so well profiled. And the alveoli, they're literally cupped in these capillaries to allow for exchange. And that allows exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. But the whole point is to have tremendous surface area. When you look at that surface area and you look at the alveolar sacs, it's just a huge, huge surface area and extremely capillary rich for gaseous exchange. Okay, at this point, I'm going to stop here because really we've covered the anatomical parts, and then we're going to look further at gas exchange coming up next. Thanks, folks.